When widower Evan Reyes inherited his grandfather's crumbling farmhouse, the whole town laughed. The single father was already struggling to keep his 9-year-old son fed and housed, working double shifts at the local diner just to scrape by. The ramshackle property, with its sagging roof and collapsing barn, seemed like the final cruel joke life had played on him. His wealthy in-laws called it worthless junk. The bank threatened foreclosure. Even his son's classmates mocked their new home. But Evan saw something different in those weathered waltzer, chance to give his boy the stability they'd never had. What none of them knew was that hidden beneath decades of neglect lay blueprints and journal entries that would change everything. His grandfather hadn't left him a burden. He'd left him a fortune worth $120 million. But would Evan discover the secret before the ruthless developers circling like vultures seized everything he held dear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the 2-bedroom apartment Evan Reyes called home, casting long shadows across the cramped living space that had become both sanctuary and prison. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune, a sound that had marked the beginning of countless difficult days over the past 3 years since Maria's death. Evan stood at the kitchen counter, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug that bore the faded logo of the diner, where he'd been pulling double shifts for longer than he cared to remember. "Dad, my shoes don't fit anymore," came the small voice from the hallway. Miguel appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, holding up a pair of sneakers that had seen better days. At 9 years old, the boy possessed his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn chin, a combination that broke Evan's heart and gave him strength in equal measure. "We'll figure something out, my Joe," Evan said, kneeling to examine the worn shoes. The soles were separating from the uppers, and Miguel's toes were clearly cramped against the front. Another expense they couldn't afford, another reminder of how far they'd fallen since Maria's medical bills had consumed everything they'd saved. The apartment walls seemed to close in around them as Evan prepared Miguel's luncher peanut butter sandwich, an apple that had seen better days, and a juice box from the discount store. The refrigerator hummed with the strain of keeping their meager provisions fresh, its handle held together with electrical tape that Evan had applied months ago. "Mrs. Henderson says we might have to move again," Miguel said quietly, referring to their landlord's wife, who lived in the unit below them. The woman had a kind heart but a practical mind, and she'd been dropping hints about the rising rent and Evan's increasingly late payments. Evan's jaw tightened. "Don't worry about Mrs. Henderson, we'll be fine." But even as he spoke the words, Evan knew they rang hollow. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter told a different story: overdue notices, final warnings, and the ever-present threat of eviction that hung over their heads like a storm cloud. The life insurance payout from Maria's death had disappeared into the medical debt black hole, leaving them with nothing but memories and mounting obligations. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet. Evan glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach drop. Dolores Reyes Martinez, his late wife's mother, never called with good news. "Hello, Dolores," Evan answered, his voice carefully neutral. "Evan, we need to talk." Her voice carried the same imperious tone that had made family gatherings uncomfortable even when Maria was alive. "Carlos and I have been discussing Miguel's situation." "What situation would that be?" "Don't play dumb with me. The boy is living in poverty while you chase your pride around that worthless property you inherited. It's time to face reality." Evan closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his in-laws' judgment. Carlos and Dolores Reyes Martinez had built a successful construction business from nothing, and they'd never let anyone forget it. They'd tolerated Evan when Maria was alive, but since her death, they'd made their feelings clear he wasn't good enough for their daughter, and he certainly wasn't good enough to raise their grandson. "Miguel is fine where he is," Evan said, watching his son gather his backpack, with the careful precision of a child who'd learned to take care of himself too early. "Fine, living in that cramped apartment, wearing clothes from the thrift store, eating government-subsidized lunches. We can give him opportunities, Evan. Private school, college fund, a real future. The words stung because they contained enough truth to cut deep. Evan had been thinking the same thoughts during his sleepless nights, wondering if his pride was standing in the way of what was best for Miguel. But every time he considered their offer, he remembered Maria's dying words. Don't let them take him from you. He needs his father. I'm his father, Evan said quietly. Are you? Or are you just a man too stubborn to admit when he's beaten? After the call ended, Evan sat in his truck outside Miguel's school, staring at the inheritance letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. The law firm's letterhead looked official and imposing, but the message was simple. His grandfather, Antonio Reyes, had died and left him a farmhouse on 15 acres outside town. The property came with back taxes owed, no clear title, and a structure that the county assessor had generously described as uninhabitable. Evan had driven out to look at the place only once, and the sight had nearly broken his resolve. The farmhouse sagged like a tired old man, its roof patched with mismatched shingles and its front porch supported by makeshift wooden posts. The barn had partially collapsed, and the fields were overgrown with weeds and volunteer saplings. To most people, it looked like exactly what it was, a burden nobody wanted. But as Evan had walked through the empty rooms, feeling the solid bones of the old house beneath layers of neglect, he'd remembered his grandfather's hands. Those weathered fingers had built this place, had carved a life from nothing more than determination and hope. Antonio Reyes had been a dreamer, Maria had always said. A man who saw possibilities where others saw only problems. The bell rang at Miguel's school, and children began streaming out of the building. Evan spotted his son immediately. Miguel had a way of moving through crowds that suggested he was used to being on his own. The boy climbed into the truck with the resigned air of someone who'd learned not to expect surprises. "How was school?" Evan asked. "Fine." Miguel's standard response, delivered with the same neutral tone Evan himself used with difficult customers at the diner. They drove in comfortable silence through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, a collection of modest homes and struggling businesses that had seen better days. The pawn shop where Evan had sold Maria's jewelry was still advertising quick cash for valuables. The check-cashing place where he'd been getting his paycheck converted to cash was offering tax preparation services with a giant inflatable dancing figure out front. "Dad," Miguel said as they pulled into their apartment complex, "what's a junk farm?" Evan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Where did you hear that?" Tommy Martinez said his mum told him, "We inherited a junk farm." He said his grandparents might buy it for cheap and tear it down. Tommy Martinez Carlos and Dolores' grandson from their daughter Elena, a boy who attended private school and had never wanted for anything. The casual cruelty of childhood, amplified by adult prejudices, passed down like family heirlooms. "It's not a junk farm," Evan said carefully. "It's your great-grandfather's house, the place where your grandmother grew up." Miguel considered this information with the seriousness of a child who'd learned to read between the lines. "Are we going to live there?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and fear. Evan had been wrestling with the same question for weeks, running the numbers in his head and finding them wanting. The farmhouse needed everything: new roof, new plumbing, electrical work, foundation repairs. Even if he could somehow manage the immediate fixes, the property taxes were 3 months behind, and the bank was already making inquiries about foreclosure. But the alternative was accepting defeat, letting Carlos and Dolores take Miguel, and spending the rest of his life knowing he'd given up without a fight. "Maybe," Evan said finally. "Would you want to?" Miguel's eyes brightened for the first time in weeks. "Could we fix it up? Make it nice?" "It would take a lot of work." "I'm good at work." That evening, after Miguel had gone to bed, Evan sat at their small kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, trying to make the impossible numbers add up. His savings account held $347. His checking account was overdrawn by 23. The diner job paid enough to cover their current expenses if nothing went wrong, but it left no room for the kind of investment a property like his grandfather's farmhouse would require. The inheritance letter sat beside the calculator, along with a set of keys that looked older than Evan himself. According to the lawyer, the property had been in the family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son, with the understanding that it would always remain a Reyes home. Antonio had been the last of his generation, a bachelor who devoted his life to tinkering in his workshop and dreaming of inventions that never quite made it to market. The phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Elena Martinez, Carlos and Dolores's daughter, and Miguel's aunt. Elena had always been the reasonable one in the family, the peacemaker who tried to smooth over the tensions that arose whenever the extended family gathered. "Evan, I hope you don't mind me calling so late." "Not at all, Elena. How are you?" "I'm worried about you and Miguel. Mum and Dad are talking about getting lawyers involved, and I don't want to see this turn ugly." Evan felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of lawyers?" "The kind that ask questions about living conditions and financial stability. Look, I know they mean well, but they're scared. They see Miguel struggling, and they think they can fix it with money." "And what do you think?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "I think Miguel needs his father, but I also think he needs stability, and right now, you're not providing that." The words hit harder because they came from someone who genuinely cared about both of them. Elena had been Maria's favorite sister-in-law, the one who'd held Evan's hand during the worst days of his wife's illness and who'd helped him navigate the immediate aftermath of her death. "I'm doing the best I can," Evan said. "I know you are, but maybe it's time to consider that your best might not be enough on your own." After Elena hung up, Evan walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot where his truck sat among the other vehicles of people who were just getting by. The apartment complex was quiet except for the distant sound of a television and the hum of the highway beyond the chain-link fence. He thought about his grandfather's hands again, remembered the way Antonio had shown him how to use tools when Evan was barely older than Miguel was now. The old man had been patient and gentle, never raising his voice even when Evan made mistakes. "Every problem has a solution," Antonio used to say. "Sometimes you just have to look at it from a different angle." Maybe it was time to look at their problems from a different angle. The farmhouse might be a burden, but it was also a possibility. It was a chance to give Miguel something more than the cramped apartment and the constant worry about money. It was a chance to build something instead of just surviving. The next morning, Evan called in sick to the diner, the first time he'd missed work in 6 months. He picked Miguel up from school early, telling the secretary they had a family emergency that required immediate attention. As they drove toward the outskirts of town, Miguel pressed his face against the window, watching the familiar streets give way to open fields and scattered farmhouses. "Where are we going, Dad?" "To see your great-grandfather's house, to see if it's really as bad as everyone says it is." The farmhouse looked even worse in the harsh light of afternoon than it had during Evan's brief evening visit weeks earlier. The roof sagged in 2 places, the front steps were rotted through, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split over time. The barn had lost more of its roof, and the fields were a tangle of weeds and volunteer trees that stretched toward the horizon. But Miguel saw something different. He climbed out of the truck and walked toward the house with the careful steps of an explorer discovering new territory. His small hands traced the weathered porch railings, and his eyes took in the solid stone foundation and the tall windows that had been built to catch the morning light. "It's big," Miguel said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's falling down," Evan replied, but there was no real conviction in his voice. They walked around the property together, father and son taking inventory of the damage and the possibilities. The workshop behind the house was in better condition than the main structure, its thick walls and slate roof having weathered the years with more dignity. Inside, Evan found his grandfather's tools arranged on pegboard with the precision of a man who'd spent his life building things with his hands. Miguel ran his fingers along the workbench, leaving tracks in the dust. "What did great-grandfather make here?" "I don't know," Evan admitted. "Your grandmother used to say he was always working on something, but I never knew what." They climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor of the farmhouse, testing each step carefully. The bedrooms were small but well-proportioned, with dormer windows that looked out over the fields. In what had been the master bedroom, Evan found a dresser still filled with his grandfather's clothes, as if the old man had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. "Dad," Miguel called from the smaller bedroom, "look at this." Evan found his son standing in front of a window that faced west, toward the mountains that rose in the distance. The view was spectacular, a panorama of rolling hills and open sky that stretched for miles. In the foreground, an old oak tree spread its branches over what had once been a vegetable garden, its trunk thick enough to climb and its canopy wide enough to shade half the yard. "I could have a tree house," Miguel said quietly. "You could," Evan agreed. As they stood there together, looking out at the land that had been in their family for 3 generations, Evan felt something shift inside him. The farmhouse might be a ruin, but it was their ruin. The fields might be overgrown, but they were their fields. For the first time since Maria's death, he felt the possibility of building something instead of just surviving. "What do you think, mijo?" Evan asked. "Should we take a chance on this place?" Miguel looked up at his father with eyes that held more hope than fear. "I think great-grandfather would want us to fix it up." That evening, as they drove back to their apartment, Evan made a decision that would change everything. He would cash out his meager 401 pay the back taxes on the farmhouse, and move them in before Carlos and Dolores could make good on their legal threats. It was a gamble with stakes he couldn't afford to lose, but it was better than giving up without a fight. "Are you sure about this?" Miguel asked as they pulled into their apartment complex. Evan looked at his son, saw Maria's courage reflected in those dark eyes, and felt his grandfather's determination flowing through his veins. "I'm sure," he said. "We're going to make this work." The farmhouse might be a burden, but it was also a beginning, and sometimes, Evan thought, beginning was all you needed. The first night in the farmhouse tested every ounce of determination Evan possessed. The moving truck had departed that afternoon, leaving their meager possessions scattered across the living room like driftwood after a storm. The electricity worked, barely, but the ancient wiring created an ominous humming in the walls that made Miguel nervous. The water ran brown for 10 minutes before clearing, and the heating system wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. "Dad, there's a drip in my room," Miguel called from upstairs, his voice echoing through the empty house. Evan climbed the creaking stairs with a bucket and a collection of towels, finding his son standing beneath a growing water stain on the ceiling. The October rain had started just after sunset, a steady drumbeat that revealed every weakness in the farmhouse's defenses. Within an hour, they'd positioned containers throughout the second floor to catch the various leaks. "Maybe we should sleep downstairs tonight," Evan suggested, but Miguel shook his head with the stubborn determination he'd inherited from both sides of his family. "I want to sleep in my room. It's my room now, right?" "Right," Evan agreed, spreading a tarp over Miguel's mattress and positioning the bucket beside the bed. "We'll fix the roof tomorrow." As Miguel settled into his makeshift bedroom, Evan wandered through the house with a flashlight, taking inventory of the immediate problems. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily into a sink, stained by decades of mineral deposits. The living room windows rattled in their frames, and cold air seeped through gaps around the front door. Every room told a story of gradual decline, of a house slowly surrendering to time and weather. But beneath the decay, Evan could sense the bones of something solid. The hardwood floors, though scarred and dulled, were genuine oak. The crown molding, despite its chipped paint, showed the craftsmanship of an earlier era. The stone fireplace dominated one wall of the living room, its hearth blackened by countless fires, but its structure sound and imposing. Around midnight, a particularly loud crash from upstairs sent Evan running toward Miguel's room. He found his son sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and pointing toward the corner where a section of ceiling plaster had given way to the persistent leak. Water poured through the opening, splashing onto the floor and revealing the wooden slats and horsehair insulation beneath. "I'm sorry, Dad," Miguel said, his voice small in the darkness. "I know we don't have money to fix it." Evan knelt beside the bed, brushing wet plaster dust from his son's hair. "It's not your fault, my Joe. Houses this old have their own way of talking to us." "What's it saying?" "It's saying it needs help, and we're going to help it." They moved Miguel's mattress to the living room, setting up a temporary bedroom near the fireplace where the ceiling was solid and dry. As his son finally drifted off to sleep, Evan sat in his grandfather's old recliner, listening to the rain and the house's symphony of creaks and groans. The morning brought grey skies and the sobering reality of their situation. Evan stood in Miguel's damaged room, staring at the hole in the ceiling and calculating repair costs he couldn't afford. The leak had revealed more than just damaged. The roof decking was rotted, the insulation was contaminated, and the electrical wiring looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. "Dad, look what I found," Miguel called from the corner of the room. Evan turned to see his son crouched beside the damaged wall, his small fingers tracing the edge of a wooden panel that had come loose during the night's excitement. The panel was about 2 feet square, set into the wall at child height, and it had shifted just enough to reveal a dark space behind it. "Careful," Evan warned, but Miguel had already worked his fingers into the gap and was pulling the panel free. "There's something back here," Miguel said, his voice filled with excitement rather than fear. Evan took the flashlight and peered into the opening Miguel had discovered. The space behind the panel was larger than he'd expected, carved out between the wall studs to create a hidden compartment about the size of a small closet. The beam of his flashlight caught the edge of what looked like lots of paper, tied with string and wrapped in oilcloth. "What is it?" Miguel asked, bouncing on his toes with anticipation. Evan reached into the cavity and carefully extracted the first bundle. The oilcloth was old but intact, protecting whatever lay inside from decades of moisture and neglect. He set the bundle on Miguel's mattress and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a collection of papers covered in his grandfather's careful handwriting. The top page was dated 1967 and titled "Perpetual Energy Conversion System Preliminary Design Notes." Below the title, Antonio's flowing script filled the page with diagrams, equations, and detailed observations about electromagnetic field manipulation and energy storage systems. Even to Evan's untrained eye, the work looked sophisticated and purposeful. "Is it important?" Miguel asked, leaning over his father's shoulder to study the mysterious papers. "I think it might be," Evan said, his voice carrying a note of wonder he hadn't felt in years. They spent the morning exploring the hidden compartment, extracting bundle after bundle of documents. Antonio had been methodical in his record-keeping, dating each page and organizing his work into categories that suggested a mind capable of remarkable focus and innovation. There were technical drawings that looked like patent applications, correspondence with universities and research institutions, and detailed journals documenting experiments conducted in the workshop behind the house. Miguel proved to be an enthusiastic assistant, carefully sorting the papers by date, while Evan tried to understand the scope of what they'd discovered. One bundle contained what appeared to be a complete set of blueprints for a device Antonio had called the Reyes Regenerative Energy System. The drawings were precise and detailed, showing a machine about the size of a washing machine that seemed designed to convert ambient electromagnetic energy into usable electrical power. "Your great-grandfather was an inventor," Evan told Miguel as they spread the blueprints across the living room floor. "A real inventor, not just someone who liked to tinker with tools. Like Thomas Edison. Maybe better than Thomas Edison." The deeper they dug into Antonio's hidden archive, the more impressive the scope of his work became. There were letters from MIT professors praising his theoretical insights, correspondence with patent attorneys discussing the commercial potential of his designs, and detailed financial projections suggesting that Antonio had understood the economic implications of his inventions. One letter, dated 1971, caught Evan's particular attention. It was from a representative of General Electric, expressing interest in purchasing Antonio's energy conversion patents for a sum that made Evan's hands shake as he read the figure. $200,000, a fortune in 1,971 money, enough to set a man up for life. Why didn't he sell it? Evan wondered aloud. Miguel, who had been studying a technical drawing with the intense concentration of a child solving a puzzle, looked up with bright eyes. Maybe he was saving it for us. That afternoon, while Miguel napped on the living room couch, Evan sat surrounded by his grandfather's papers and tried to piece together the story they told. Antonio had been brilliant. There was no question about that. His theoretical understanding of energy systems was decades ahead of its time, and his practical designs showed the kind of innovative thinking that had built American industry. But something had gone wrong. The correspondence ended abruptly in 1972. The patent applications were never filed, and the workshop experiments seemed to have been abandoned mid-project. There were hints of problems, references to industrial interference and patent theft and competing interests that suggested Antonio had encountered obstacles beyond mere technical challenges. The final document in the collection was a letter addressed to "My Future Family," dated just 6 months before Antonio's death. In it, the old man explained that he'd hidden his life's work because powerful interests had tried to steal it from him. He'd refused to let his innovations be used for profit without proper compensation, and he'd chosen to wait for a time when his family might be able to claim what was rightfully theirs. "The energy crisis will come," Antonio had written in his careful script. "When it does, the world will need solutions that serve people, not just corporations. My inventions were meant to help families power their homes without dependence on utility companies. Someday, someone in our family will understand their value and find a way to bring them to the world." As Evan read those words, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the farmhouse's drafty windows. Antonio hadn't left them a burden, he'd left them a treasure. The question was whether Evan possessed the intelligence, determination, and resources to claim it. That evening, as he and Miguel shared a dinner of canned soup heated on the old gas stove, Evan found himself looking at their situation with new eyes. The farmhouse might be falling down, but it was also the repository of innovations that could change their lives forever. The roof might leak, but beneath it lay the answer to problems they'd never imagined their family was capable of solving. "Dad," Miguel said, setting down his spoon and fixing his father with a serious look, "are we going to be okay?" Evan looked at his son, thought about his grandfather's hidden legacy, and felt something shift in his chest. For the first time since Maria's death, he allowed himself to believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. "Yes, Mijo," he said, "I think we're going to be better than okay." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows and sent leaves skittering across the farmhouse porch. But inside, surrounded by the evidence of his grandfather's genius, Evan Reyes began to understand that some inheritances were worth more than money. Some legacies were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The November morning brought frost to the farmhouse windows and a painful reminder of how much work lay ahead. Evan stood in the kitchen, nursing his second cup of coffee, while studying his grandfather's journal entries by the pale light, filtering through glass that hadn't been cleaned in decades. Miguel sat at the scarred wooden table, carefully organizing the technical drawings they'd discovered, his small hands treating each paper like a precious artifact. "Listen to this," Evan said, reading from a journal entry dated 1969. "Today I achieved stable energy output for 6 consecutive hours. The electromagnetic resonance chamber maintains consistent field strength even when drawing power for household applications. Maria thinks I'm chasing dreams, but I know this technology could free every family in America from dependence on power companies." Miguel looked up from his sorting project. "Great-grandfather knew Grandma Maria. She was his daughter, Mijo. Your grandmother grew up in this house." The boy's eyes widened with understanding. "So this was her room? The one with the hole in the ceiling?" "Probably. She would have been about your age when he was writing these journals." As Evan continued reading, he began to understand the scope of his grandfather's vision. Antonio hadn't just been tinkering with energy system, she'd been developing a complete alternative to the electrical grid. His notes described devices that could harvest ambient electromagnetic energy from radio waves, power lines, and even the Earth's magnetic field, converting it into usable electricity for homes and businesses. The technical concepts were beyond Evan's understanding, but the practical implications were clear. If Antonio's inventions actually worked, they could eliminate electric bills entirely. Families could generate their own power, store it in his specially designed battery systems, and live completely independent of utility companies. No wonder someone tried to steal his patents, Evan muttered. Who tried to steal them? Miguel asked. Evan showed his son a series of letters that painted a disturbing picture. Beginning in 1970, Antonio had been approached by representatives of major energy companies offering to purchase his patents. When he'd refused their lowball offers, the tone of the correspondence had shifted. There were veiled threats about patent challenges, warnings about the costs of defending intellectual property, and suggestions that a small inventor might find himself overwhelmed by the resources of large corporations. The final letter in the sequence, from a law firm representing interested parties, had been blunt. Mr. Reyes would be wise to accept reasonable compensation for his work rather than pursue independent development that might prove unprofitable. They tried to scare him, Evan explained to Miguel. But your great-grandfather was stubborn. He decided to hide his work instead of selling it to people who might use it wrong. Miguel studied the threatening letter with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand adult complications. Are those same people still around? I don't know, but we need to be careful about who we tell about this. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Through the grimy window, Evan could see a woman in her 60s standing on the porch, holding what looked like a covered dish. He opened the door to find Martha Hendricks, their nearest neighbor, whose small house sat about a quarter-mile down the gravel road. I brought you some cornbread, Martha said, offering the dish with a warm smile. Figured you and the boy might be getting tired of canned soup. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hendricks. Please come in. Martha stepped into the farmhouse and looked around with the appraising eye of someone who remembered when the place had been well maintained. She was a widow herself, Evan knew, having lost her husband 2 years earlier to cancer. Her own property was modest but immaculate, a testament to the kind of pride and determination that had built rural communities. Place looks better already, she said diplomatically. Antonio would be pleased to see family living here again. You knew my grandfather? Oh, honey, everyone knew Antonio. He was always willing to help when folks had problems with their electrical systems or needed something fixed. Smartest man in 3 counties, people used to say. Miguel emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the mention of his great-grandfather. Martha's face lit up when she saw him. And you must be Miguel. You look just like your grandmother did at that age. Maria was such a sweet child, always helping her father in that workshop of his. What did they make in the workshop? Miguel asked. Martha's expression grew thoughtful. Hard to say, exactly. Antonio was always working on something, but he was private about his projects. Your grandmother used to tell me he was going to change the world someday. As Martha shared memories of Antonio and the farmhouse's better days, Evan found himself seeing the property through different eyes. This had been a place of innovation and hope, where a brilliant man had pursued dreams that might have transformed how people lived. The current decay was temporary, result of neglect, not inherent failure. After Martha left, Evan spent the afternoon in his grandfather's workshop, trying to understand the relationship between the theoretical work in the journals and the practical tools and equipment Antonio had accumulated. The workshop was larger than it appeared from outside, with workbenches along 3 walls and storage areas filled with electronic components, metal fabrication tools, and measuring instruments that looked more sophisticated than anything Evan had expected to find. In one corner, covered by a canvas tarp, he discovered what appeared to be a partially completed device about the size of a large toolbox. The construction was elegant and precise, with hand-wound copper coils, carefully machined metal components, and electronic circuits assembled with the kind of attention to detail that suggested both technical skill and artistic sensibility. Miguel joined him in the workshop after finishing his homework, and together they studied the mysterious device. According to the corresponding journal entries, it was a proof-of-concept energy converter designed to demonstrate the basic principles of Antonio's larger system. "Does it work?" Miguel asked. "Only one way to find out," Evan said, locating the power switch among the device's controls. When he flipped the switch, nothing happened for several seconds. Then, gradually, a soft humming filled the workshop, and a series of small lights began to glow along the device's control panel. The display showed numbers that meant nothing to Evan, but the fact that the machine was doing something after decades of dormancy suggested that Antonio's engineering had been as solid as his theory. "It's working," Miguel whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Something's working," Evan agreed, "but I don't know what it's supposed to do." They spent an hour experimenting with the device, following instructions from Antonio's journal entries. The machine seemed designed to detect and measure electromagnetic fields, and when Evan connected it to a small light bulb as described in the notes, the bulb glowed with a steady, warm light. "Where's the power coming from?" Miguel asked. Evan checked the device's connections and found no power cord, no batteries, no obvious energy source. According to the readings on the display panel, the machine was somehow generating electrical current from ambient electromagnetic field exactly as Antonio's theories had predicted. "I think," Evan said slowly, "your great-grandfather really did figure out how to make electricity from nothing." That evening, after Miguel had gone to bed, Evan sat in the kitchen with the proof-of-concept device and his grandfather's journals, trying to understand what he'd inherited. If Antonio's theories were correct, and if the larger system described in the blueprints actually worked, they weren't just sitting on a valuable invention, they were sitting on technology that could revolutionize how the world generated and used energy. The implications were staggering. Independent power generation could free families from utility bills, reduce dependence on fossil fuels, and provide electricity to remote areas where traditional grid connections were impractical or expensive. In the right hands, Antonio's inventions could improve millions of lives while generating enormous wealth for their developers. But as Evan read more of his grandfather's notes, he understood why Antonio had hidden his work rather than pursue its commercial development. The energy industry was worth trillions of dollars, and established companies wouldn't welcome technologies that threatened their business models. Antonio had been wise enough to recognize that a small inventor, challenging powerful interests, needed more than just brilliant ideas. He needed resources, connections, and protection that a simple farmer couldn't provide. Now those challenges would fall to Evan. He was a single father with no technical background, limited financial resources, and powerful in-laws who wanted him to give up the farmhouse entirely. How could he possibly succeed where his brilliant grandfather had chosen to wait for better circumstances? The answer came to him as he studied a family photograph he'd found among Antonio's papers. The picture showed a young Maria standing beside her father in the workshop, both of them smiling with the confidence of people who believed in their ability to solve problems. Antonio hadn't been waiting for someone smarter or richer to claim his legacies. He'd been waiting for someone with the determination to fight for what was right. Evan looked around the farmhouse kitchen, with its cracked linoleum and outdated appliances, and made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to hide Antonio's work or sell it to the highest bidder. He was going to learn everything he could about his grandfather's inventions, find a way to protect them legally, and bring them to the world the way Antonio had always intended. It wouldn't be easy. He'd need help from people who understood patents and technology and business development. He'd need to repair the farmhouse and create a stable home for Miguel, while pursuing a dream that seemed impossible from his current perspective. Most of all, he'd need to believe in himself the way Antonio had believed in the power of innovation to change the world. But as he sat in his grandfather's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of one man's remarkable vision, Evan Reyes felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death: hope for a future that held more than just survival. The December wind cut through the farmhouse like a blade, finding every gap in the old windows and doors, despite Evan's attempts at weatherization. He'd spent the past month learning to live with the house's quirks while diving deeper into his grandfather's technical work, and each day brought new discoveries that both excited and overwhelmed him. Miguel had become his eager partner in exploration, approaching Antonio's blueprints with the fearless curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some things were supposed to be impossible. This morning, he'd spread the most detailed set of technical drawings across the living room floor, weighing down the corners with books to keep them flat. "Dad, look at this part," Miguel said, pointing to a section of the blueprint labeled Primary Energy Collection Array. "It looks like a really big version of the thing in the workshop." Evan knelt beside his son and studied the drawing. Miguel was right. The device depicted in the blueprint was essentially a scaled-up version of the proof-of-concept machine they'd been experimenting with. Instead of generating enough power to light a single bulb, this system was designed to provide electricity for an entire household. "According to this," Evan said, reading from the accompanying notes, "one unit could generate 15 kilowatts of continuous power. That's enough to run everything in a normal house. How much does electricity usually cost?" Evan did quick mental math, thinking about their old apartment's utility bills. For most families, maybe $200 a month. Sometimes more in summer when they're running air conditioning. Miguel's eyes widened. "So this could save people a lot of money?" "A lot of money," Evan agreed. "Over 20 years, a family might spend $50,000 on electricity. This could eliminate that entirely." As they studied the blueprints together, Evan began to understand the elegant simplicity of his grandfather's design. The system used multiple collection arrays to harvest electromagnetic energy from various sources: radio waves, power line emissions, atmospheric electrical activity, and even the Earth's magnetic field. The collected energy was processed through a series of conditioning circuits and stored in a battery bank that could provide power even when collection conditions were poor. Most importantly, the entire system was designed to be manufactured using readily available components. Antonio hadn't relied on exotic materials or cutting-edge technology that would make his inventions impractical to produce. He'd created solutions that could be built in any well-equipped machine shop using standard electrical and mechanical components. "Your great-grandfather was smart," Evan told Miguel. "He didn't just invent something amazing, he invented something that regular people could actually use." Their morning research session was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel road. Through the window, Evan could see a white pickup truck with Henderson Construction painted on the doors. Two men climbed out. Tone he recognized as Tom Henderson, Martha's son, and another he didn't know. Evan opened the door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch despite the cold wind. Tom Henderson was a man in his 40s, with the weathered hands and squinting eyes of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. His companion was younger and better dressed, with the soft appearance of someone who spent more time in offices than on construction sites. "Morning, Evan," Tom said. "This is David Kruger from Meridian Development. He asked me to introduce him since you've been hard to reach by phone." Evan's phone had been disconnected 2 weeks ago when he'd fallen behind on the bill, but he wasn't about to advertise that fact. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Kruger stepped forward with the practiced smile of a professional dealmaker. "Mr. Reyes, I represent some investors who are interested in your property. We understand you've inherited a challenging situation, and we'd like to help you turn it into an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "The kind that puts cash in your pocket and relieves you of a burden you can't afford to carry." Kruger gestured toward the farmhouse with its obvious repair needs. "This property requires significant investment to become habitable, and even then, it's isolated from employment centers and good schools. We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for the land, which would allow you to relocate somewhere more suitable for raising a child." The number hit Evan like a physical blow. $200,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to pay off every debt, buy a decent house in town, and provide Miguel with genuine stability. It was also suspiciously generous for property the county assessor had valued at less than $50,000. "That's a very generous offer," Evan said carefully. "What do you plan to do with the land?" "Residential development. The area is experiencing growth pressure from the city, and this property has excellent potential for subdivision into 5-acre parcels. 21st century families want space and privacy, and this location provides both." Tom Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Evan, I've known your family for 20 years. If you're thinking about selling, you should know that Meridian has been buying up properties all over this area. They're planning something big." Kruger's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're planning to bring economic development to a region that needs it. There's nothing sinister about legal real estate investment." "Legal, sure," Tom replied, "but not necessarily good for the people who've lived here for generations." After the visitors left, Evan found himself pacing the farmhouse kitchen while Miguel worked on homework at the table. $200,000 represented security beyond anything he'd dared to hope for, but something about Kruger's offer felt wrong. The man had been too eager, too willing to pay far above market value for property he claimed to want for residential development. "Dad, are we going to sell the house?" Miguel asked without looking up from his math worksheet. "I don't know. What do you think?" Miguel set down his pencil and fixed his father with a serious look. "I think great-grandfather hid his inventions because he knew bad people might try to take them. Maybe those men today are the bad people." From the mouths of babes, Evan thought. Miguel's insight cut straight to the heart of his concerns. If Meridian Development was willing to pay premium prices for rural properties, they either knew something about the land's value that Evan didn't, or they suspected the existence of something valuable on the property. That afternoon, Evan walked the farmhouse boundaries, studying the land with new eyes. The property was larger than he'd initially realized, stretching back into wooded hills that provided natural privacy and protection. The workshop was positioned to take advantage of natural electromagnetic phenomena, sitting on high ground with clear sightlines in all directions, perfectly positioned for the kind of energy collection Antonio's systems were designed to perform. If someone had discovered Antonio's work through old patent applications or university correspondence, they might understand the property's true value, even if they couldn't access the hidden technical details. Buying the land would give them control of the research site and any prototypes or equipment Antonio had left behind. The realization made Evan's decision easier. He wasn't just protecting his grandfather's legacy, was protecting something that could benefit millions of families while making him and Miguel financially secure for life. $200,000 was a lot of money, but if Antonio's inventions were real, they were worth infinitely more. That evening, as snow began to fall outside the farmhouse windows, Evan sat down with Miguel to have an honest conversation about their situation. "We could sell the house and have enough money to live anywhere we want," he said. "Nice house in town, good schools, no more worrying about repairs or heating bills." Miguel considered this carefully. "Would we still have great-grandfather's inventions?" "No. If we sell the property, we lose everything." "Then we're not selling," Miguel said with the firm conviction of someone who'd already decided what mattered most. "Great-grandfather saved this for us. We can't just give it away because it's hard." Evan felt a surge of pride in his son's courage and clarity. At 9 years old, Miguel understood something that many adults never learned, that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. "It's going to be difficult," Evan warned. "We'll have to learn things we don't understand, fix problems we don't know how to solve, and probably deal with people who want to stop us." "We can do difficult things," Miguel replied. "Mom always said Reyes men don't give up." That night, after Miguel had fallen asleep on the living room couch, Evan sat in the workshop with his grandfather's journals and began making plans. If he was going to protect Antonio's legacy and develop his inventions properly, he needed to understand the technology, secure the intellectual property rights, and find people who could help him navigate the complex world of patents and business development. The proof-of-concept device hummed quietly on the workbench, its soft glow providing light for his reading. According to Antonio's notes, the larger system would require more sophisticated manufacturing, but the basic principles were proven and scalable. What Evan needed now was time to learn, money to survive while learning, and allies who understood both the technical and commercial aspects of bringing new technology to market. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the farmhouse and its secrets in pristine white. Inside, surrounded by the evidence of his grandfather's genius, Evan Reyes began to believe that some legacies were worth any sacrifice necessary to claim them. Miguel had been right. They were going to do difficult things, but they were going to do them together, and they were going to succeed. The January morning brought an unexpected visitor, along with the mail carrier Sarah Chen, the head librarian from Miguel's school, driving a small hybrid car that looked out of place on the gravel road leading to the farmhouse. Evan watched from the kitchen window as she carefully navigated the potholes, her compact vehicle bouncing over ruts that his truck handled easily. "Miss Chen is here," he called to Miguel, who was in the living room, organizing his grandfather's correspondence by date. The boy had developed a systematic approach to cataloging Antonio's work, treating each document like a piece of a vast puzzle he was determined to solve. Miguel brightened at the news. Sarah Chen had been one of the few teachers who'd taken a genuine interest in his academic progress, especially after other students had begun teasing him about living in the junk farm. Her visit was both unexpected and welcome. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," Sarah said when Evan opened the door. "Miguel mentioned you've been doing some research, and I thought you might be interested in these." She handed him a manila envelope, thick with photocopied documents. "I've been helping the County Historical Society digitize old records, and I came across some correspondence involving your grandfather. There are letters from MIT, Stanford, even some international universities. I thought you should see them." Evan invited her in, and Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the living room scene. Technical blueprints covered every flat surface, journal pages were organized in careful stacks, and Miguel's school notebooks contained hand-drawn copies of his great-grandfather's diagrams, annotated with questions and observations. "Miguel, this is incredible work," Sarah said, examining the boy's meticulous organization system. "You've created a real research archive here." "Dad and I are trying to understand what great-grandfather invented," Miguel explained. "We think it might be important." Sarah opened the envelope she'd brought and spread the photocopied letters across the coffee table. The documents painted a picture of Antonio's reputation that neither Evan nor Miguel had fully grasped. Universities had sought his consultation on energy research projects. Government agencies had inquired about his theories. International organizations had invited him to speak at conferences on sustainable technology. "Your grandfather was famous," Sarah said simply. "Not celebrity famous, but famous among people who understood advanced energy systems. Look at this letter from Dr. Elizabeth Warren at MIT, not the senator, the physics professor. She's calling his work revolutionary and decades ahead of current research." Evan studied the letter, dated 1971, in which Dr. Warren expressed frustration that Antonio hadn't published his research or filed patents that would make his innovations available to the scientific community. "Mr. Reyes possesses insights into electromagnetic energy conversion that could transform how humanity approaches power generation," she had written. "His reluctance to share this knowledge with the broader research community is understandable given current commercial pressures, but tragic from the perspective of human progress." "Why didn't he publish anything?" Evan asked. Sarah pointed to another letter, this one from a patent attorney in Washington, D.C. "This might explain it. The attorney is warning your grandfather about industrial espionage and suggesting that premature disclosure could result in larger companies copying his work and using superior legal resources to claim ownership." Miguel had been listening intently, and now he spoke up with the directness that characterized his approach to adult complications. So great, grandfather was afraid someone would steal his inventions. That's exactly what I think happened, Sarah replied. The energy industry in the 1970s was dominated by very powerful companies that had strong reasons to prevent new technologies from disrupting their business models. Your grandfather was probably smart to keep his work private. As they discussed Antonio's situation, Evan found himself impressed by Sarah's understanding of both the technical and commercial aspects of invention and development. She asked thoughtful questions about the blueprints, offered insights into the historical context of energy research, and demonstrated a genuine enthusiasm for Miguel's systematic approach to understanding his inheritance. "You know," Sarah said, "if you're serious about developing this technology, you're going to need help from people who understand patents and engineering and business development. I might know someone who could provide guidance." "What kind of someone?" Evan asked. "My brother David. He's an intellectual property attorney in the city, and he specializes in protecting inventors' rights. He's also interested in sustainable technology as both a professional and personal passion." Evan felt a flicker of hope. Professional legal advice had seemed impossibly expensive from his current perspective, but if Sarah's brother might be willing to provide guidance, perhaps the path forward wasn't as impossible as it appeared. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching multiple vehicles from the sound of it. Through the window, Evan could see 2 pickup trucks and a sedan pulling into the farmhouse driveway. David Kruger emerged from the sedan, accompanied by 3 men Evan didn't recognize. "Expecting company?" Sarah asked. "Not exactly," Evan replied, moving to the window for a better look. The men with Kruger wore the kind of casual business attire that suggested they were comfortable in both boardrooms and construction sites. Expensive boots, designer jeans, and jackets that cost more than Evan made in a month. Kruger knocked on the front door with the confident rhythm of someone who expected to be welcomed. When Evan opened it, the developer's smile seemed less genuine than during his previous visit. "Mr. Reyes, I hope you've had time to consider our offer. I've brought some colleagues who wanted to see the property firsthand." "I haven't made any decisions yet," Evan said, not inviting them in. Of course. But I should mention that our timeline has accelerated somewhat. We're prepared to increase our offer to $250,000, but we'd need to finalize the agreement this week." The additional $50,000 hit Evan like a surprise punch. The increase confirmed his suspicions that Meridian Development knew something about the property's value that they weren't sharing. No legitimate real estate investor raised their offer by 25% without additional information. "That's very generous," Evan said carefully, "but I'm still not ready to sell." One of Kruger's companions stepped forward, tall man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. "Reyes, I'm Robert Martinez, and I represent some very serious investors. We understand you're in a difficult financial position, and we want to help you make the smart choice." "Martinez," Sarah's voice came from behind Evan. She'd joined him at the door, and her expression had changed from friendly curiosity to something approaching alarm. "Robert Martinez from Martinez Holdings? Miss Chen, isn't it? I believe you know my son Carlos and daughter-in-law Dolores." Evan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Robert Martinez wasn't just another developer. He was the patriarch of his late wife's family, the grandfather who'd built the construction empire that had made Carlos and Dolores wealthy and influential. This wasn't a random real estate transaction. It was a family ambush. "You're Miguel's great-grandfather," Evan said. "I am, and I'm here because my grandson deserves better than this." Martinez gestured toward the farmhouse with obvious disdain. "Carlos and Dolores have been too polite in their approach. They've tried to give you time to come to your senses, but time is something that boy doesn't have to waste." Miguel appeared at Evan's shoulder, drawn by the mention of his name. When he saw Martinez, his expression grew wary. The old man had never shown much interest in his great-grandson, treating Miguel as an afterthought during the few family gatherings they'd attended. "Miguel, you've grown," Martinez said with forced warmth. "How would you like to live in a real house, maybe even have your own swimming pool?" "I like this house," Miguel replied with quiet dignity. "It was great. Grandfather Antonio's house." Martinez's expression hardened. "Antonio Reyes was a dreamer who died, broke and alone. Is that really the legacy you want for your son, Evan?" The insult to his grandfather's memory made Miguel step protectively closer to his father. Sarah Chen moved to stand beside them both, creating a united front that seemed to surprise Martinez and his companions. "I think," Sarah said coolly, "that Mr. Reyes has made it clear he's not interested in selling. Perhaps you should respect his decision." Martinez studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a potential obstacle. "And you are?" "Someone who knows the difference between helping and bullying." Kruger stepped between Martinez and Sarah with the smooth intervention of a professional mediator. "Let's not let emotions escalate unnecessarily. Mr. Reyes, our offer remains open, but only until Friday. After that, market conditions may force us to pursue other opportunities in the area." The threat was barely veiled. If Evan didn't sell voluntarily, they might find ways to force the sale through legal or financial pressure. The message was clear: take the money now, or face consequences that could be much more difficult to handle. After the visitors left, Sarah helped Evan and Miguel gather the scattered documents from the living room. The atmosphere in the farmhouse had changed, charged with the tension of a conflict that was no longer theoretical. "They're scared," Sarah observed. "People don't offer that kind of money unless they're afraid of losing something valuable." "But what do they know that we don't?" Evan asked. Miguel had been unusually quiet since Martinez's departure, but now he spoke up with the clarity that always surprised his father. "Maybe they know about great-grandfather's inventions. Maybe someone told them." The possibility sent a chill through Evan's chest. If information about Antonio's work had leaked through old university correspondence or patent attorney files, powerful interests might already understand the technology's potential value. The farmhouse wasn't just their home, it was the repository of innovations that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars if properly developed. "We need help," Evan said. "Real help, from people who understand how to protect inventors' rights." Sarah nodded. "I'll call my brother tonight. David has dealt with corporate intimidation before, and he knows how to level the playing field." As evening settled over the farmhouse, Evan found himself standing in his grandfather's workshop, staring at the proof-of-concept device that had started this entire journey. The machine hummed quietly, its lights glowing with steady confidence, generating electricity from invisible forces that most people never considered. Antonio had been right to hide his work. In the wrong hands, these innovations could be buried, suppressed, or monopolized by companies that profited from maintaining the status quo. But in the right hands, in the hands of someone who understood their true purpose, they could transform how families lived and free them from dependence on utility companies that charged them for basic necessities. Miguel joined him in the workshop, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate that had become their evening ritual. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the proof-of-concept device work its quiet magic. "Dad," Miguel said finally, "are we going to fight them?" Evan looked at his son, saw Maria's courage reflected in those dark eyes, and felt his grandfather's determination flowing through his veins. "Yes, mijo, we're going to fight them. And we're going to win." Outside, the January wind rattled the workshop windows, but inside, surrounded by the evidence of Antonio's genius, father and son began to plan their defense of a legacy that belonged not just to their family, but to everyone who believed that innovation should serve people, not just profit. The February thaw brought David Chen to the farmhouse, along with the first hint of spring warmth. Sarah's brother arrived in a practical sedan that suggested success without ostentation, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen years of use and a laptop computer that looked more functional than fashionable. At 45, David possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from winning difficult cases against powerful opponents. "Miguel, I've heard a lot about your research project," David said after Sarah had made introductions. "Would you mind showing me what you and your father have discovered?" For the next hour, Miguel guided David through the archive he'd created, explaining Antonio's invention with the enthusiasm of a child sharing his favorite hobby. David listened intently, asking technical questions that demonstrated both genuine interest and professional expertise. "This is remarkable work," David said finally. "Both your great-grandfather's inventions and your documentation of them. You've essentially created a complete case file for patent protection." Evan felt a surge of hope. "So you think the inventions are patentable?" "Not only patentable, potentially revolutionary. Your grandfather was working with concepts that current energy researchers are just beginning to explore seriously. If these devices actually work as described, they could be worth more than any of us can imagine." David opened his laptop and connected to the internet using a mobile hotspot, then spent several minutes researching current patent databases and energy industry developments. What he found confirmed Evan's growing suspicions about why Meridian Development was so eager to acquire the farmhouse. "Look at this," David said, turning the laptop screen toward Evan and Miguel. 3 major energy companies have filed patents in the past 5 years for electromagnetic energy harvesting systems. None of them work as well as your grandfather's designs, but they're generating enormous investor interest. "Someone leaked his research," Evan said. "That's my guess. Your grandfather's correspondence with universities probably ended up in archives that researchers access regularly. Someone familiar with his work would recognize its value immediately." Miguel had been studying the patent applications David had found, and now he pointed to a section that caught his attention. "Dad, this part looks exactly like great-grandfather's design." They copied it. David examined the document Miguel had identified, comparing it to Antonio's original blueprints. The similarities were unmistakable. No, just the general concept, but specific technical details that suggested direct copying rather than independent development. "This is patent theft," David said grimly. "If we can prove your grandfather developed these concepts first, we can challenge these patents and potentially claim damages." "What kind of damages?" Evan asked. "Conservative estimate, $50 to $100 million. If the technology proves as revolutionary as your grandfather believed, we could be talking about much more." The numbers made Evan's head spin. Yesterday, he'd been worried about paying the heating bill. Today, he was discussing legal strategies that could make his family wealthy beyond imagination. The transition felt surreal, like stepping from a black-and-white movie into Technicolor. But David's next words brought him back to reality. Of course, proving patent theft against major corporations isn't easy. They have legal teams that specialize in making these problems disappear, and they're not above using intimidation tactics to discourage challenges. "What kind of intimidation tactics?" Miguel asked. David looked at the boy with the serious expression he might use with an adult client. "Sometimes they try to buy off the competition. Sometimes they create legal problems that cost too much to fight. Sometimes they make life difficult in other ways." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted David's explanation. Through the window, Evan could see a convoy that looked more official than Meridian Development's previous visits to County Sheriff's vehicles and a sedan with government plates. "Expecting more company?" David asked dryly. "Definitely not," Evan replied, moving toward the front door with a growing sense of dread. Sheriff Robert Kellum stood on the farmhouse porch, holding a clipboard and wearing the uncomfortable expression of someone delivering bad news. Evan had known Kellum for years. The man was honest and fair, but he followed the law regardless of personal feelings. "Evan, I'm sorry to be here on official business," Kellum said. "I've got a warrant to inspect the property for code violations and safety hazards. Anonymous complaint filed with the county." "What kind of violations?" David asked, stepping up beside Evan. Kellum consulted his clipboard. "Structural integrity, electrical safety, habitability standards for a minor child. County building inspector needs to examine the premises and file a report." The building inspector emerged from the sedan, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the officious demeanor of someone who enjoyed exercising bureaucratic authority. He immediately began photographing the farmhouse's exterior, focusing on every visible repair need and structural flaw. "This is harassment," David said quietly to Evan. "Someone's using county code enforcement to create legal justification for removing Miguel from the home." The realization hit Evan like a physical blow. If the county declared the farmhouse uninhabitable, Child Protective Services could remove Miguel from his custody, and Carlos and Dolores would have legal grounds to pursue guardianship. The timing wasn't coincidental. This was exactly the kind of pressure David had warned them about. Miguel appeared at Evan's shoulder, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "Are they going to make us leave?" "Not if I can help it," Evan said, but his voice carried less conviction than he intended. The inspection lasted 3 hours and covered every inch of the farmhouse from foundation to roof. The building inspector documented everything: the temporary patches on the ceiling, the outdated electrical system, the makeshift heating arrangements, the general state of repair that reflected Evan's limited resources rather than his intentions. "Mr. Reyes," the inspector said as he prepared to leave, "you'll receive a formal report within 10 days. I recommend consulting with contractors immediately about bringing this structure up to code." After the officials departed, David helped Evan understand the legal implications of what had just occurred. The county would likely declare the farmhouse uninhabitable unless significant repairs were completed within a specific time frame. Those repairs would cost more money than Evan possessed, creating a legal basis for removing Miguel from an unsafe environment. "How long do we have?" Evan asked. 30 days, probably. Maybe 60 if we can negotiate extensions." "And how much will the repairs cost?" David's expression was grim. "Based on what I observed today, $50,000 to $75,000 minimum." The amount was impossibly large from Evan's current perspective, but David's next observation offered a glimmer of hope. "However, if we can prove your grandfather's patent claims and establish their value, we might be able to secure financing based on the intellectual property. Banks sometimes lend against proven patents, especially ones with clear commercial potential." That evening, as David prepared to return to the city, he outlined a strategy for protecting both Miguel's custody and Antonio's legacy. They would need to work on multiple fronts, simultaneously proving the patent's validity, documenting their theft by major corporations, securing financing for farmhouse repairs, and building legal defenses against custody challenges. "It's going to be a fight," David warned. "These people have resources and connections, and they're not above playing dirty. But you have something they don't: the truth and the rightful claim to innovations that could change the world." Miguel had been listening intently to the adult conversation, and now he spoke up with the kind of insight that consistently surprised his father. "They're scared because great-grandfather's inventions could help people save money. If families don't have to pay electric bills, the power companies lose money." "That's exactly right," David confirmed. "Your great-grandfather created technology that threatens a trillion-dollar industry. That's why some people are willing to fight so hard to control it." After David left, Evan found himself standing in the workshop with his grandfather's proof-of-concept device, thinking about the battle they were about to fight. In one corner stood powerful corporations with unlimited resources and decades of experience crushing innovative competitors. In the other corner stood a single father and his 9-year-old son, armed with nothing but the truth and the determination to honor a brilliant man's legacy. The odds were overwhelming, but as Evan watched the device generate electricity from invisible forces, he remembered something Antonio had written in his journals. "Every great innovation faces resistance from those who profit from the status quo. The question isn't whether they'll fight you, whether you'll fight back." Miguel joined him in the workshop, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate and wearing the expression of someone who'd made an important decision. "Dad, I know this is going to be hard, but great-grandfather saved his inventions for us, and we're going to save them for other families. That's what Reyes men do, right? We don't give up." Evan looked at his son, felt Maria's courage and Antonio's determination flowing through his veins, and knew that regardless of the odds, they were going to fight. not just for themselves, but for everyone who believed that innovation should serve people instead of just profit. The battle for Antonio's legacy was about to begin. The March morning that changed everything began with Sarah Chen's excited phone call, her voice crackling through the old landline Evan had installed when his cell service became unreliable. "Evan, you need to get to the courthouse right away. David found something in the patent records that you have to see in person." An hour later, Evan and Miguel sat in David Chen's downtown office, surrounded by file boxes and computer printouts that covered every available surface. David's normally composed demeanor had been replaced by barely contained excitement mixed with professional outrage. "I've been researching patent applications related to your grandfather's work," David explained, "and I found something that changes everything we thought we knew about this situation." He spread a series of documents across his desk, photocopies of patent applications, correspondence, and legal filings that spanned several decades. At first glance, they looked like the routine paperwork of invention and development, but David's explanation revealed their explosive significance. "Your grandfather did file patents," David said, "not under his own name, but through a shell company called Reyes Innovation Technologies. He established the company in 1970, filed comprehensive patents for his energy systems in 1971, and those patents were approved by the U.S. Patent Office in 1973. Evans stared at the documents, trying to process what he was hearing. "But I thought he never filed anything. That's why we were worried about proving his priority." "That's what someone wanted you to think. Look at this." David handed him a legal document, dated 1974. 1 year after the patents were approved, Reyes Innovation Technologies was acquired by a larger company called Progressive Energy Solutions. Your grandfather received $2 million for the sale. $2 million? Miguel's eyes widened. Where did the money go? David's expression grew grim. "That's where this story gets interesting. Progressive Energy Solutions was a subsidiary of Martinez Holdings, Robert Martinez's company. Your grandfather sold his patents to your late wife's family." The revelation hit Evan like a sledgehammer. Everything he'd believed about his grandfather's situation, about the family dynamics, about the current fight over the farmhouse, all of it had been built on lies and omissions that went back 50 years. "But why would grandfather sell to them?" Evan asked. David produced another private letter from Antonio to Robert Martinez that had been preserved in the legal files. "Because Martinez convinced him it was the only way to protect the technology from being stolen by larger corporations. Look at what your grandfather wrote." Evan read aloud from Antonio's careful handwriting. "Mr. Martinez, I appreciate your family's commitment to developing my inventions responsibly. Your promise to use these technologies to help working families achieve energy independence aligns with my original vision. I trust that this partnership will ensure my life's work serves people rather than just profit." "Martinez promised to develop the technology for families," Miguel said, his young voice heavy with understanding. "But he didn't do it, did he?" "Not only did he not develop it," David replied, "he buried it completely. Progressive Energy Solutions never manufactured a single device based on your grandfather's patents. They filed the patents away and let them sit unused for decades." David pulled out a thick folder containing financial records and corporate documents. "But here's the truly criminal part. Over the past 20 years, Martinez Holdings has licensed aspects of your grandfather's patents to major energy companies. They've made over $120 million selling rights to technology they never developed themselves." The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $120 million, the same amount Kruger had mentioned in their very first conversation, the sum that had seemed too fantastic to be real. It wasn't a projection of future value, it was the documented profit from 50 years of licensing Antonio's stolen innovations. "So, when they offered to buy the farmhouse for $250,000, Evan said slowly, "they were trying to pay us $250,000 to walk away from technology they've already used to make $120 million. "Exactly, And there's more. David opened his laptop and showed them a series of recent corporate filings. Martinez Holdings is preparing to sell those patent rights to a consortium of international energy companies for an estimated $500 million. The sale is scheduled to close next month. Miguel had been listening with the intense concentration he brought to complicated problems, and now he asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. But if great-grandfather sold the patents, don't they belong to Martinez Holdings now? David smiled, the first genuinely pleased expression Evan had seen from him all morning. That's where Martinez made his fatal mistake. The sale agreement included a reversion clause. He showed them the relevant section of the 1974 contract, highlighted in yellow marker. If Progressive Energy Solutions failed to develop and commercialize the technology within 25 years, all rights would revert to Antonio Reyes or his heirs. 25 years expired in 1999, and Martinez never developed anything. So the patents belong to us, Evan asked. Not just the patents, all the profits Martinez has made from licensing them. Under the terms of the reversion clause, he's been selling rights to technology he doesn't own for the past 24 years. The implications were staggering. Not only did Evan and Miguel own patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but they had legal grounds to recover decades of profits that Martinez had earned through what amounted to theft. Why didn't Martinez tell us about this when we inherited the farmhouse? Evan asked. Because he was hoping you'd never find out. As long as you believed the patents didn't exist, he could continue profiting from them indefinitely. The farmhouse purchase was probably meant to eliminate any possibility of you discovering the truth. David gathered the documents and placed them in a secure file folder. Evan, you and Miguel aren't just fighting for your grandfather's legacy anymore. You're fighting to recover stolen property worth more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. As they prepared to leave David's office, the attorney outlined the immediate legal steps they would need to take. Filing injunctions to stop Martinez's pending patent sale, documenting the reversion clause violation, and preparing lawsuits to recover past profits would require coordination with federal courts and potentially international legal authorities. How long will this take? Evan asked. Complex patent litigation usually takes years, but we have an advantage. The evidence is overwhelming, and Martinez knows it. Once we file the initial paperwork, he'll probably want to negotiate rather than face public exposure of what he's done. That afternoon, as they drove back to the farmhouse, Miguel sat quietly in the passenger seat, processing what they'd learned. Finally, he spoke with the gravity that had become his trademark. Dad, great-grandfather trusted Mr. Martinez because he married into our family, but Mr. Martinez stole from us for 50 years. That's right, Maijo. Are we going to get the money back? Evan thought about Antonio's letter, about the old man's faith that his innovations would someday help working families achieve energy independence. The money mattered, but it wasn't the most important thing Martinez had stolen from them. We're going to get everything back, Evan said. The money, the patents, and the chance to do what your great-grandfather always wanted, bring this technology to families who need it. That evening, as father and son sat in the workshop surrounded by evidence of Antonio's genius, the proof-of-concept device hummed with quiet confidence. The machine had been generating free electricity for months, demonstrating the potential of innovations that could transform how the world approached energy production. Miguel traced his finger along one of his great-grandfather's technical drawings, following the elegant lines that represented 50 years of stolen dreams. Great-grandfather knew this day would come, he said. That's why he hid the blueprints where we would find them. Evan looked at his son, marveled at the boy's insight and determination, and felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death, absolute certainty that they were fighting on the right side of history. Martinez Holdings had built its fortune on stolen innovation, but that era was about to end. Tomorrow, David would file the legal papers that would begin the process of reclaiming Antonio's legacy. The battle would be difficult and probably lengthy, but for the first time since this journey began, Evan knew they were going to win. Not just because they had the law on their side, but because they had something Martinez had never possessed: the courage to fight for what was right, regardless of the odds. The April morning that would determine their family's future began before dawn, with Evan and Miguel working by lamplight in the farmhouse kitchen, preparing for the most important day of their lives. In 6 hours, David Chen would present their case before federal judge Patricia Morrison in a hearing that could either restore Antonio's stolen legacy or leave them vulnerable to the full weight of Martinez Holdings' legal retaliation. "Dad, are you nervous?" Miguel asked, carefully organizing the documents they would need for court in the same methodical way he'd catalogued his great-grandfather's inventions. "Terrified," Evan admitted, grateful for his son's calming presence, "but also excited. We're finally going to tell the truth about what happened to your great-grandfather's work." The past month had been a whirlwind of legal preparation, document gathering, and strategic planning that had tested every aspect of their resolve. David had assembled a case file that read like a thriller: novel decades of corporate deception, stolen innovation, and systematic suppression of technology that could have transformed millions of lives. The evidence was overwhelming, but Evan had learned enough about legal battles to understand that overwhelming evidence didn't guarantee victory when facing opponents with unlimited resources and political connections. Martinez Holdings had hired the same Washington law firm that represented major oil companies, and their strategy had become clear during preliminary hearings: delay, obfuscate, and exhaust their opponents' resources through procedural warfare. "Mr. Reyes, the defendants are requesting another continuance," Judge Morrison had said during their last court appearance. "They claim they need additional time to review the complex technical evidence." David had responded with barely controlled frustration. "Your Honor, this is the 4th continuance request. The defendants have had 6 months to review evidence that took us 6 weeks to compile. They're simply trying to outlast a family with limited resources." The judge had agreed, setting today's hearing as the final opportunity for both sides to present their cases before she ruled on the central question: did the 1974 reversion clause transfer Antonio's patents back to his heirs, making Martinez Holdings' subsequent licensing deals illegal? As Evan and Miguel finished breakfast, Sarah Chen arrived to drive them to the courthouse. Her presence had become essential to their emotional survival over the past month, providing both practical support and the kind of steady encouragement that helped them maintain perspective during the darkest moments of preparation. "How are my favorite legal warriors this morning?" Sarah asked, though her cheerful tone couldn't quite mask her own nervousness about the day ahead. "Ready to fight," Miguel replied with the conviction that had sustained him throughout this ordeal. "Great. Grandfather's inventions belong to families, not corporations." The drive to the federal courthouse took them through the city's business district, past the gleaming towers that housed the kind of corporate power they were challenging. Evan found himself thinking about the stark contrast between their modest farmhouse and the executive suites, where decisions affecting millions of lives were made by people who'd never worried about paying electric bills. David met them at the courthouse steps, looking every inch the experienced litigator in his best suit and carrying a briefcase that contained the fruits of months of investigative work. His confidence was reassuring, but Evan could see the tension around his eyes that suggested he understood the stakes as clearly as anyone. "How are we looking?" Evan asked. "Good. Very good, actually. Martinez's legal team made a strategic error yesterday that might have handed us the victory." David explained that Martinez Holdings had filed a last-minute motion claiming that Antonio's patents were invalid due to prior art existing technology that supposedly predated his innovations. The motion was clearly desperate, but more importantly, it required Martinez's lawyers to acknowledge that they were currently licensing technology based on Antonio's original work. "They can't argue that the patents are both invalid and valuable enough to license for hundreds of millions of dollars," David said. "They've essentially admitted that Antonio created something unique and commercially viable." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged with the kind of tension that surrounded high-stakes legal battles. Martinez Holdings had brought a team of 8 attorneys, led by Margaret Walsh, a legendary corporate defender, known for her ability to make even the most damning evidence seem ambiguous. Robert Martinez himself sat at the defendant's table, looking older than Evan, remembered but still radiating the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Beside him sat Carlos and Dolores, their faces set in expressions of grim determination that suggested they viewed this hearing as a family war rather than a legal proceeding. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of the decisions she would make. At 65, she had a reputation for fairness, intelligence, and impatience with legal theatrics that wasted the court's time. This matter concerns patent rights, contractual obligations, and allegations of corporate malfeasance spanning 5 decades. Judge Morrison began. I expect both sides to present their cases clearly and concisely, focusing on facts rather than rhetoric. David's opening statement was a masterpiece of clear, compelling narrative that traced Antonio's journey from innovative farmer to naive victim of corporate manipulation. He walked the judge through the timeline of events, using Antonio's own words from letters and journals to illustrate how a brilliant inventor had been systematically deceived and ultimately robbed. Your Honor, this case is about more than money, David said, his voice carrying the controlled passion of someone who genuinely believed in his cause. It's about whether corporations can steal innovations from individual inventors and profit from that theft for decades without consequences. Margaret Walsh's opening was equally polished, but focused on technical legal arguments designed to obscure the moral clarity of the situation. She argued that the reversion clause was ambiguous, that Martinez Holdings had made good faith efforts to develop the technology, and that Antonio's heirs had waited too long to assert their claims. The plaintiffs are essentially asking this court to void legitimate business agreements based on retrospective interpretations of contractual language, Walsh said. Such a precedent would undermine the stability of commercial relationships and discourage investment in innovative technologies. The morning session focused on technical evidence, with expert witnesses explaining the revolutionary nature of Antonio's energy systems and documenting how they had influenced subsequent developments in the field. Miguel sat beside his father, following the testimony with the intense concentration he brought to any discussion of his great-grandfather's work. During the lunch break, David pulled Evan aside to discuss strategy for the afternoon session. Walsh is going to focus on the reversion clause language, trying to convince the judge that commercialization doesn't require actual manufacturing. We need to be ready with evidence that Martinez never intended to develop the technology. What kind of evidence? Internal corporate documents that show Martinez viewed the patents as defensive acquisitions technology to be buried rather than developed. Sarah's brother isn't the only one who knows how to research corporate archives. The afternoon session began with David presenting a series of internal Martinez Holdings memos that painted a damning picture of corporate strategy. The documents showed that company executives had explicitly discussed suppressing Antonio's technology to protect their investments in traditional energy infrastructure. Our analysis indicates that widespread adoption of the Reyes energy systems could reduce demand for our core services by 60 to 70%, one memo stated. Recommendation: maintain patent control to prevent commercial development by competitors. Walsh objected repeatedly to the admission of these documents, arguing they were taken out of context and misrepresented legitimate business planning. But Judge Morrison allowed them into evidence, and their impact was devastating to Martinez Holdings' claims about good faith development efforts. The key moment came when David called Robert Martinez himself to testify. The old man approached the witness stand with visible reluctance, his usual confidence replaced by the wariness of someone who knew he was about to face questions he couldn't answer honestly. David's examination was surgical in its precision. Step by step, He led Martinez through the timeline of his acquisition of Antonio's patents, his promises to develop the technology, and his subsequent licensing deals with major corporations. Mr. Martinez, in 50 years of ownership, has Martinez Holdings ever manufactured a single device based on Antonio Reyes's patents? We explored various development possibilities, Martinez replied evasively. That's not what I asked. Have you ever manufactured anything? No. Have you ever established manufacturing facilities for this purpose? No. Have you ever hired engineers specifically to develop this technology? We consulted with various experts. Mr. Martinez, yes or no? In 50 years, have you made any genuine effort to bring Antonio Reyes's inventions to market? The pause stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Martinez answered in a voice barely above a whisper. No. The admission echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Even Walsh seemed momentarily stunned by her client's honesty, though she quickly moved to limit the damage through redirect examination. As the hearing concluded, Judge Morrison announced that she would issue her ruling within 10 days. The legal arguments were complete, the evidence had been presented, and now the fate of Antonio's legacy rested in the hands of one person who would decide whether 50 years of corporate theft would finally face consequences. Walking out of the courthouse, Evan felt emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. They had presented the strongest possible case, exposed Martinez Holdings' deception, and forced Robert Martinez to admit his failure to honor his promises to Antonio. How do you think we did? Miguel asked as they waited for Sarah to bring the car around. David's answer was measured but encouraging. I think we proved everything we needed to prove. Now we wait and see if justice means anything in federal court. That evening, as they sat in the farmhouse kitchen surrounded by the documents that had consumed their lives for months, Evan reflected on how much had changed since that first night when Miguel had discovered the hidden compartment. They had gone from desperate survival to the verge of claiming one of the largest patent settlements in history. But win or lose, they had already achieved something more valuable than money. They had honored Antonio's memory, told the truth about corporate theft that had lasted 5 decades, and shown Miguel that some fights were worth pursuing regardless of the odds. Dad, Miguel said as they prepared for bed, whatever happens, great-grandfather would be proud of us for trying. Evan looked at his son, marveled at the boy's wisdom and courage, and felt a deep sense of peace despite the uncertainty ahead. They had fought the good fight, told the truth, and stood up to power in defense of what was right. Whatever Judge Morrison decided, they could face the future knowing they had honored the legacy of a brilliant man who had trusted them to carry his dreams forward. Outside the farmhouse windows, the April evening settled over the land that had sheltered Antonio's secrets for so many years. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or defeat. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of his grandfather's genius, Evan Reyes felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally learned to fight for something bigger than himself. The call came at 7:30 on a Monday morning that would forever divide Evan's life into before and after. Judge Morrison's clerk delivered the news in the neutral tone that court personnel used when announcing decisions that would change lives. The judge will read her ruling at 10 o'clock this morning. Both parties should be present. Evan's hands shook as he hung up the phone. After 10 days of waiting, of alternating between hope and despair, of trying to maintain normal routines while their entire future hung in the balance, the moment of truth had finally arrived. "Miguel," he called upstairs, "get dressed. We're going to court." His son appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing pajamas, but his eyes were alert and focused. "Is today the day?" "Today's the day." The drive to the courthouse passed in a blur of nervous energy and last-minute preparations. David met them at the security checkpoint, looking professionally composed despite the tension that radiated from his posture. "Any hints about which way this might go?" Evan asked. "Morrison is impossible to read," David replied, "but the fact that she's announcing the decision in open court rather than just filing written orders suggests she wants to make a statement." The courtroom was more crowded than Evan had expected. In addition to the attorneys and principals, reporters from several business publications had somehow learned about the hearing. The patent dispute had attracted attention in legal circles as a test case for how courts would handle corporate theft of individual inventors' work. Robert Martinez sat at the defendant's table surrounded by his legal team, but his usual arrogance had been replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. Carlos and Dolores flanked him, their faces set in expressions of resigned defiance. At exactly 10 o'clock, Judge Morrison entered the courtroom and took her seat with the deliberate movement of someone who understood the weight of the moment. She had clearly given considerable thought to her decision, and her opening words suggested she intended to address not just the legal issues, but their broader implications. This case presents fundamental questions about the relationship between individual innovation and corporate power. Judge Morrison began. The court has carefully considered the evidence, the applicable law, and the long-term consequences of its decision. She reviewed the facts methodically, walking through Antonio's original invention, his decision to trust Martinez Holdings, and the subsequent 50 years of patent suppression and corporate profiteering. Her recitation was clinical but devastating to Martinez's position. The defendant Martinez Holdings argues that its licensing activities constitute good faith efforts to commercialize the plaintiff's technology. The court finds this argument wholly without merit. Evan felt Miguel's small hand slip into his, providing strength at the moment when his own courage threatened to falter. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Martinez Holdings acquired the Reyes patents with no intention of developing them for public benefit. Instead, the company systematically suppressed revolutionary technology while profiting from licensing agreements that generated over $120 million in revenue. Judge Morrison's voice grew stern as she addressed the defendants directly. This court finds that Martinez Holdings violated both the letter and spirit of its 1974 agreement with Antonio Reyes. The reversion clause was unambiguous. Failure to commercialize within 25 years would return all rights to the inventor's heirs. The judge paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. Evan could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears as she prepared to announce the specific terms of her decision. Therefore, the court hereby orders that all patent rights to the Reyes energy systems immediately revert to Evan Reyes and Miguel Reyes as the lawful heirs of Antonio Reyes. Furthermore, Martinez Holdings is ordered to cease all licensing activities and prepare a full accounting of profits generated from these patents since 1999. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, whispered conversations, and the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. David squeezed Evan's shoulder, his professional composure cracking just enough to reveal a triumphant smile. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Additionally, the court finds that Martinez Holdings' conduct constitutes willful patent infringement and unjust enrichment. The company is hereby ordered to pay restitution of $127 million, representing the full amount of licensing revenue generated through unauthorized use of the plaintiff's intellectual property. The number hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt, $127 million, an amount so large that Evan couldn't fully process its meaning. Miguel looked up at his father with wide eyes, as if seeking confirmation that he'd heard correctly. Margaret Walsh immediately rose to address the court. "Your Honor, the defendants respectfully request a stay of this order pending appeal. The financial implications." "Denied," Judge Morrison said firmly. "The defendants have profited from stolen intellectual property for 24 years. They can begin making restitution immediately while pursuing whatever appeals they deem appropriate." She turned to address David directly. "Counselor, please coordinate with the court's financial officers to establish appropriate mechanisms for asset transfer and ongoing monitoring of compliance." As the judge prepared to leave the bench, she delivered one final observation that would be quoted in legal journals for years to come. This case serves as a reminder that innovation belongs to innovators, not to those with the power to suppress it. The court will not allow corporate theft to be legitimized through the passage of time. The gavel fell with the finality of thunder, and suddenly the courtroom exploded into controlled chaos. Reporters rushed toward David and Evan, their questions overlapping in an unintelligible jumble. Walsh huddled with her clients at the defendant's table, her face grim as she began explaining their limited options for appeal. David guided Evan and Miguel through the crowd toward a conference room where they could speak privately. The walk felt surreal, as if Evan were watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. "We won," Miguel said, his voice filled with wonder. "We actually won." "You did more than win," David replied. "You achieved one of the largest patent settlements in history. But more importantly, you restored your great-grandfather's reputation and ensured his inventions will finally reach the people he meant them to help." In the quiet of the conference room, away from the media circus and legal maneuvering, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. They weren't just wealthy now, they were wealthy enough to pursue Antonio's original vision without compromise or interference. "What happens next?" Evan asked. "Martinez Holdings will probably appeal, but appeals courts rarely overturn factual findings this clear. Meanwhile, you need to decide how you want to manage your grandfather's technology and the resources to develop it properly." Miguel had been unusually quiet during the adult conversation, but now he spoke up with the clarity that had guided them through this entire journey. "We're going to build great-grandfather's machines and help families save money on electricity." That's what he wanted. Evan looked at his son, thought about Antonio's vision of energy independence for working families, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They had won the legal battle, but the real work, the work of bringing revolutionary technology to the world, was just beginning. "Yes, Mijo," he said. "That's exactly what we're going to do." The media storm that followed Judge Morrison's ruling transformed their quiet farmhouse into the center of a national conversation about innovation, corporate power, and the rights of individual inventors. By Tuesday afternoon, news vans lined the gravel road, and reporters with satellite trucks had turned their front yard into an impromptu broadcast center. "Dad, there's a man from CNN at the door," Miguel called from the living room window, where he'd been watching the circus with the fascinated attention of a child observing exotic animals. Evan groaned and rubbed his temples. They'd been fielding interview requests since Monday evening, and each conversation seemed to generate 10 more calls from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers who sensed a compelling story about David versus Goliath in the modern age. Sarah Chen had become their unofficial media coordinator, screening calls and helping them navigate the sudden transition from private citizens to public figures. Her teaching background had prepared her for managing chaos, though even she seemed overwhelmed by the scale of attention their victory had generated. "The Today Show wants you to fly to New York," Sarah reported, consulting the notebook where she'd been tracking interview requests. 60 Minutes is interested in a feature story, and someone from Hollywood called about film rights. "Film rights?" Evan asked weakly. Apparently, the idea of a single father and his son taking on corporate America resonates with audiences. The caller mentioned something about feel-good David and Goliath with a technical twist. Miguel looked up from his homework with bright eyes. "Could I be in the movie?" "Let's focus on real life first," Evan replied, though he couldn't help smiling at his son's enthusiasm. The boy had handled their sudden fame with remarkable composure, treating media attention as just another interesting development in their ongoing adventure. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who managed to slip past the media gauntlet, Martha Hendricks, carrying a covered dish and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in justice had been vindicated. "I brought celebration casserole," Martha announced, settling into the farmhouse kitchen as if news crews weren't camped on the property. "Figured you boys might be too busy to cook with all this excitement." "Martha, you don't have to." "Nonsense. Your grandfather would be tickled pink to see how this turned out. Antonio always said his inventions would help regular folks someday, and now they will." As Martha unpacked her casserole and began heating it on the stove, she shared memories of Antonio that provided welcome perspective on their sudden transformation. "He was never interested in being famous or rich," she said, "but he would have loved knowing that his work finally reached people who needed it." That evening, after the news crews had departed for their hotel rooms and the phone had stopped ringing, Evan and Miguel sat in the workshop surrounded by Antonio's inventions and contemplated the future that had suddenly opened before them. "Dad, what are we going to do with all that money?" Miguel asked. It was a question Evan had been wrestling with since Judge Morrison announced the settlement amount. $127 million was more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. But Antonio's legacy demanded something more meaningful than just personal wealth. "We're going to do what your great-grandfather always wanted," Evan said. "We're going to build his machines and make them available to families who need them." They had already begun planning the next phase of their journey. David was helping them establish a foundation that would oversee development and distribution of Antonio's technology. The goal was to make energy independence accessible to working families, rather than just another luxury for the wealthy. "But first," Evan continued, "we're going to finish fixing up this house and make it the kind of home your great-grandfather always dreamed it could be." The farmhouse renovation would be their first project, not just repairs to meet county codes, but a complete restoration that honored both the building's history and Antonio's vision for sustainable living. Solar panels, energy storage systems, and a working demonstration of the electromagnetic collection technology would turn the property into a showcase for what was possible when innovation served people instead of just profit. Miguel had been studying one of Antonio's technical drawings while they talked, and now he looked up with the expression that meant he'd had an important realization. "Dad, do you think great-grandfather knew this would happen, that we would find his inventions and fight for them?" Evan considered the question seriously. Looking back over the past months, he could see a pattern of preparation that suggested Antonio had indeed anticipated this moment. The careful documentation, the hidden archive, the detailed technical drawings, all of it, had been preserved with the kind of systematic thinking that came from someone who understood both the value of his work and the obstacles it would face. "I think he hoped," Evan said finally. "I think he hoped that someday someone in our family would be brave enough to fight for what was right." Their conversation was interrupted by headlights in the driveway, not the glaring spots of media trucks, but the modest beams of a single car approaching with careful respect for the late hour. Through the window, Evan could see David Chen climbing out of his sedan, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who had important news to share. "Sorry to bother you so late," David said when Evan opened the door, "but I wanted to deliver this personally." He handed Evan an official-looking document with the seal of the United States Patent Office. "Your grandfather's patents were officially transferred back to your names this afternoon. As of 4 o'clock today, you and Miguel are the legal owners of technology that could revolutionize how the world generates and uses energy." The document was beautifully produced, with formal language that somehow made their victory feel more real than Judge Morrison's courtroom pronouncement. Seeing their names listed as patent holders connected them directly to Antonio's legacy in a way that transcended legal technicalities. "There's something else," David said, producing a second document from his briefcase. "Martinez Holdings has agreed to an expedited settlement rather than pursue appeals. They'll transfer the full $127 million within 30 days, along with all technical documentation they've accumulated over 50 years of patent ownership." The news meant their victory was complete and final. No lengthy appeals process, no years of uncertainty, no possibility that corporate lawyers might find some technical loophole to exploit. Martinez Holdings had acknowledged defeat and agreed to make full restitution. "Why?" Evan asked. "Why not fight it?" David's smile was grim. "Because Judge Morrison's ruling has triggered SEC investigations into their business practices. Fighting the patent decision would keep their corporate malfeasance in the headlines, while federal investigators examine 50 years of potentially illegal activity. They want this story to disappear as quickly as possible. After David left, Evan found himself standing in the workshop with Miguel, looking at the proof-of-concept device that had started their entire journey. The machine hummed quietly, generating electricity from invisible forces just as it had for months, but now it represented something larger than just technical innovation. "Miguel," Evan said, "your great-grandfather's inventions are going to change the world. But more importantly, they're going to help families who struggle the way we used to struggle." The boy nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who had learned that some victories meant more than just personal success. "We're going to make sure great-grandfather's dreams come true." Outside the workshop windows, the April night was clear and peaceful, unmarked by the media circus that had disrupted their day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, surrounded by evidence of Antonio's genius and the promise of justice finally achieved, father and son felt the deep satisfaction of people who had fought for something bigger than themselves and won. 6 months later, the October morning light streamed through the gleaming windows of the restored farmhouse, illuminating rooms that had been transformed from decay to demonstration of what was possible when innovation served people instead of just profit. Evan stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast while watching Miguel practice soccer in the backyard, and marveled at how completely their lives had changed while somehow remaining fundamentally the same. The farmhouse had become everything Antonio had dreamed. It could be a working showcase for sustainable technology that proved families could live comfortably while generating their own energy. Solar panels covered the south-facing roof, battery banks stored power in the basement, and Antonio's electromagnetic collection system hummed quietly in the workshop, contributing clean electricity to a grid that had once seemed impossibly expensive. More importantly, the house had become a home in ways that transcended its physical improvements. Miguel's confidence had blossomed along with their financial security, but he remained the thoughtful, determined boy who had helped organize his great-grandfather's papers by lamplight in a drafty living room. Success hadn't changed their essential relationship, father and son, working together toward goals that mattered more than personal wealth. "Dad, Miss Chen is here," Miguel called from the backyard, waving toward the driveway where Sarah's car was approaching, with its characteristic caution over the now smooth gravel road. Sarah had become an integral part of their new life, her relationship with Evan developing naturally from friendship through shared purpose into something deeper and more permanent. She brought wisdom, humor, and stability to their family dynamic, while her educational background helped them navigate the complex world of technology development and public outreach. "The first production units are ready for testing," Sarah announced as she joined them for breakfast, consulting the tablet where she tracked their foundation's activities. The manufacturing facility in Tennessee completed initial assembly last week, and the quality control tests exceeded all specifications. They had spent months establishing Reyes Energy Solutions as a company dedicated to bringing Antonio's technology to working families at affordable prices. Rather than licensing the patents to large corporations, they had built their own manufacturing capability and distribution network designed to serve people who needed energy independence most. "How many orders do we have?" Miguel asked, his interest in the business side of their operation reflecting his growing understanding that great inventions meant nothing without great execution. 1,200 families so far, Sarah replied, and the waiting list grows every day. The first customers had been people like themselves, families, struggling with high utility bills, single parents trying to create stability for their children, elderly couples on fixed incomes who couldn't afford rising energy costs. Each installation represented not just a commercial transaction, but the fulfillment of Antonio's original vision. "Your great-grandfather would be so proud," Evan told Miguel as they reviewed the morning's reports. "His inventions are finally helping the people he always meant them to help." The doorbell interrupted their planning session, and Evan found Tom Henderson on the front porch, holding an official-looking document and wearing the pleased expression of someone delivering good news. "Thought you'd want to see this right away," Tom said, handing Evan a letter from the county assessor's office. "They've officially designated this property as a historical landmark. The farmhouse and workshop are now protected as the birthplace of revolutionary energy technology." The designation meant that Antonio's legacy would be preserved for future generations, ensuring that the story of his innovations and the long struggle to claim them would continue inspiring inventors and entrepreneurs facing their own battles against entrenched interests. Miguel had been reading over his father's shoulder, and now he spoke with the satisfaction of someone who understood the deeper meaning of official recognition. Now everyone will know that great-grandfather was a real inventor, not just someone who liked to tinker. The afternoon brought visitors they had been expecting for weeks, representatives from the Smithsonian Institution who wanted to acquire some of Antonio's original prototypes for a permanent exhibition on American innovation. The proposal honored both the technical brilliance of his work and the human story of persistence in the face of corporate suppression. "Mr. Reyes, your grandfather's story represents something essential about the American spirit," the curator explained as they toured the workshop. "Individual inventors changing the world through determination and creativity, even when facing overwhelming opposition from established interests." As evening settled over the farmhouse, Evan found himself standing in the same spot where he'd first contemplated their impossible situation 9 months earlier. The view was the summer-rolling fields, distant mountains, the oak tree where Miguel now had his promised treehouse, but everything else had been transformed by their decision to fight for what was right. The financial security was wonderful, of course. Never again would they worry about paying bills or providing Miguel with opportunities he deserved. But the real treasure was something more valuable than money, the knowledge that they had honored Maria's memory and Antonio's legacy, while proving that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Miguel joined him at the window, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate in continuation of their evening ritual. At 10 years old, he had experienced more change and challenge than most adults faced in their entire lives, but he remained grounded in values that had sustained their family through every crisis. "Dad, do you think we'll have more adventures?" Miguel asked. Evan considered the question seriously. Their patent victory had opened doors they were still discovering, and requests for collaboration came daily from inventors, entrepreneurs, and organizations working on sustainable technology. The foundation was growing, the manufacturing business was expanding, and plans were developing for educational programs that would teach young people about innovation and perseverance. "I think," Evan said, "that the best adventures are just beginning." He thought about Sarah's quiet presence in their lives, about the families who would benefit from Antonio's technology, about the young inventors who might find inspiration in their story. The farmhouse had been restored, the patents had been reclaimed, and justice had been achieved. But those victories were just the foundation for something larger and more meaningful. Outside the farmhouse windows, the October evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Evan of Maria's favorite sunset. She would have loved seeing Miguel grow into the confident, thoughtful boy he was becoming. She would have been proud of their fight for Antonio's legacy and their commitment to using their success to help other families. As father and son stood together in the kitchen of the house that had sheltered 3 generations of Reyes dreamers, Evan felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned the difference between surviving and thriving. They had faced impossible odds and found the courage to fight back. They had honored the past while building a future. Most importantly, they had discovered that some inheritance courage, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what was right were worth more than all the money in the world. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Evan asked Miguel as they prepared for bed. "Ready for anything," the boy replied, with the confidence of someone who had learned that impossible was just another word for difficult. And as the farmhouse settled into peaceful quiet, protected by the legacy of one brilliant inventor and sustained by the courage of the family who had fought to claim it, Evan Reyes knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to honor the dreams of a man who had trusted them to carry his vision forward into a world that desperately needed innovation, guided by wisdom and powered by wisdom, rind, hope,